There's no need to feel guilty. I haven't done anything I'm ashamed of. Maybe I should have killed 400 or 500 people, then I would have felt better. Then when I felt like I really offered society something.
Have you ever wondered how a cult leader is made? What propels them? What moves them? And most importantly, how on earth do they control hundreds of minds? Our answer lies in one of America's most notorious cult leaders, Charles Manson. Charles's story is as intriguing as it is horrific. A small, failed musician and drifter leading a ragged band of young people to commit crimes as theatrical as they were savage. How did a man who never even pulled the trigger become the face of monstrous violence? And the big mystery question, how did he convince his followers to do whatever he wanted? Let's dive right into the mystery of Charles Manson, a boy of the system. For a man responsible for such dark and influential crimes, one would expect Charles Manson to look intimidating. But he didn't. He was small and wiry. In fact, some would even describe him as almost fragile-looking, more like someone you'd overlook in a crowded room than a figure capable of bending others to his will. He didn't have that presence, but what he did have was a smooth tongue, a sharp mind, and some confidence to go with it. It is the same confidence he leaned on his entire life, and it didn't begin while he was locked up. It began long before, in the scattered pieces of a childhood no one really ever fully put together. Charles was born in 1934 in Cincinnati to a teenage mother who wasn't ready to raise a child. His father vanished almost immediately, leaving his young son in the arms of a woman drifting between unstable relationships and occasional run-ins with the law. For most children, childhood is a period of protection and guidance. For Charles, it was something closer to a revolving door. One temporary home after another, each shaped by instability, each teaching him that nothing safe lasts for long. It's easy to sympathize with younger Charles. He learned to take care of himself early, and while it wasn't in a heroic, resilient way, he did what he could with the little opportunities he had at the time. From childhood, Charles learned how to steal whenever he needed something. At the time, it probably wasn't out of malice, but necessity. However, as he grew, the facade peeled off, and what was left was a boy who loved to inflict terror. The first time Charles was arrested, he was still just a boy. A stolen bicycle, then a stolen candy bar, then a break-in. Small crimes, always explained away by officials as misbehavior, but each one chipped away at his sense that the world had rules worth following. The state tried to correct him through reform schools, but those places were often harsh, understaffed, and violent. Instead of structure, he found survival. And instead of discipline, he found a new kind of education that taught him that manipulation was safer than honesty, and that charm could protect him better than fists. He became a quick study. He learned who to flatter, who to avoid, and how to shift his personality like a mask, depending on who was watching. Those early institutions didn't fix Charles. In fact, they shaped him. By the time he reached his teens, he was already fluent in the language of confinement. He understood the pecking orders inside juvenile halls. He learned how to play the role of the obedient inmate when necessary. And most importantly, he learned how to read people, how to scan their insecurities, their wants, their emotional gaps, and offer them whatever version of himself would win their trust. In one facility, staff said he could be polite and helpful. In another, inmates said he was cunning and unpredictable. Both were true, depending on what he needed that day. But just like every other kid out there, Charles had a dream. Unfortunately, his talent wasn't enough. The West Coast Dream. Charles's life was shaped by institutions long before he became a household name. He was first sent to a juvenile facility at age 13, but his longest and most defining imprisonment began in the late 1950s. By then, he had accumulated a long list of petty crimes, stealing cars, forging checks, and violating probation. Nothing glamorous or violent even, just the kind of small, desperate crimes committed by someone who had never learned how to function outside institutions. In 1959, however, when he was 24, Charles was given a 10-year federal sentence for forging a treasury check. a serious offense at the time. The charge itself wasn't shocking. What made the sentence long was his history of repeated parole violations and escape attempts from earlier juvenile institutions. The court simply saw him as someone who could not live by the rules on the outside. While in prison during the early 60s, he picked up additional infractions and was repeatedly denied parole. He tried to present himself as cooperative, but his record showed manipulation, inconsistent behavior, and zero stability. Ironically, he often begged officials not to release him, saying prison felt safer than freedom. Finally, after nearly 7 years, he was paroled in March 1967 at age 32. When Charles stepped out of prison, he wasn't a young man looking for direction. He was a man who had spent half his life behind bars, carrying the survival skills, insecurities, and manipulative habits that institutions had sharpened in him. This context is important because Charles didn't hit the streets as a criminal mastermind. Instead, he came out as someone who had never learned how to build a normal life, someone who had learned how to read people, perform confidence, and attract those who were emotionally searching. Those institutional lessons became the foundation of everything he did next. Unlike many inmates, Charles didn't emerge fearful or disoriented. In fact, he walked right out as if he'd been waiting for the right audience. At the time, America was in the middle of the counterculture movement. Peace signs, flower crowns, open roads, and young people searching for meaning, far from their parents' expectations. It was a moment when the usual boundaries were blurred, and Charles, who had spent most of his life behind walls, suddenly found himself in a world that rewarded charisma more than conformity. It felt like a stage built especially for him. He drifted to San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district, a place where thousands of young people had gathered to experiment with freedom. The air was thick with music, incense, and ideas. Into this colorful chaos walked a man who knew how to read vulnerability the way a musician reads notes. And while Charles wasn't talented in the traditional sense, he was persistent. He carried a guitar everywhere, strumming until someone stopped to listen. At first, he was just another drifter chasing a creative dream. But slowly, people began to gather around him. Young women especially found him interesting. His talk of love, freedom, and spiritual awakening felt like the escape they were searching for. Yet beneath that soft-spoken charm was something sharper. Charles wasn't just trying to build a group of friends, he was testing the ground for influence. When he talked, he watched how people reacted. When he sang, he paid attention to who leaned in and who drifted away. He was collecting people the way others collected memories. The idea of becoming a musician wasn't just a hobby for him. It was a chance at legitimacy. In Los Angeles, he managed to cross paths with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, who briefly took a liking to him and the girls who followed him everywhere. Charles interpreted this brush with fame as a sign that the universe was preparing him for something bigger. But when the music world didn't embrace him the way he expected, his ambitions curdled into resentment. Still, he never abandoned the idea that music held secret meanings. He was especially fixated on the Beatles. Their 1968 White Album became, in his mind, a set of coded messages. Where others heard poetic lyrics and experimental sound, Charles heard instructions, warnings, prophecies, and calls to action. Whether he truly believed this or simply used it as a tool to impress and control his followers is still debated. What is clear is that he used the album to build a mythology around himself. He started describing a coming upheaval, a dark turning point he claimed he could interpret because he was awakened. As he traveled with his slowly growing group by bus, by hitchhiking, by aimless wandering along the California coast, he crafted a world where he was at the center. Everything pointed back to him: the music, the dreams, the predictions. Interestingly, he didn't force people to follow him. He made himself the answer to whatever questions they were already carrying. California gave him sunshine, freedom, and an audience. And Charles, who had spent a lifetime learning how to perform, stepped into the role eagerly. He wasn't a prophet or even a genius. But in a decade desperate for meaning, he learned to speak the language people wanted to hear. Armed with these tactics, Charles was ready to take on the world. But first, he would need compliant, willing people to do the dirty work for him. Building the cult. For Charles, the burning question wasn't simply where to find followers. He had already learned from years of institutional life that people could be observed, studied, and influenced. The deeper question was, how could he create a group that would give him both power and purpose? A space where he was unquestionably in control, and where the chaos of his own life could be rewritten as a narrative of authority. The roots of this ambition trace back to his childhood and all the decades he had spent navigating instability, rejection, and unpredictability. He had learned that loyalty could be cultivated and dependence manufactured. If the world had been unsafe, he reasoned, the solution was to create his own world, one he could shape entirely. The second influence came from the counterculture itself. California in the late 60s was a time when social norms were loosening. Young people were searching for belonging, identity, and spiritual meaning. This environment offered fertile ground for someone who could translate insecurity into direction. For Charles, these wandering, searching individuals were not just potential friends or romantic partners. They were instruments through which he could construct his vision of society, his family, and, eventually, the vehicle for his plans. He began deliberately shaping the environment. Instead of simply gathering friends, he created rules, routines, and rituals that subtly shifted responsibility and authority toward himself. Group living, communal chores, music sessions, and rituals were not random. Each served a purpose. Chores instilled obligation. LSD and long discussions destabilized personal judgment while reinforcing his guidance. Music became a shared language and a symbolic anchor. Over time, his followers' sense of self was intertwined with the group, and the group's stability depended on him. Finally, Charles framed the outside world as dangerous, corrupt, and incapable of understanding the group. Isolation was no longer incidental, it was intentional. Dependency was not just convenient, it was essential. By the time most followers realized the extent of their commitment, leaving would mean not just abandoning a group, but abandoning a version of reality that Charles had meticulously built. He had engineered a network of relationships, beliefs, and obligations that converged on him as the center, and he called it the family. By the time the family had stabilized in Southern California, Manson's methods were clear. Find those searching for purpose, offer acceptance, then gradually shape their lives, beliefs, and loyalties until they existed primarily to reinforce his vision. What had begun as a personal survival mechanism had now become the foundation of a full-fledged cult. Radicalization in plain sight. By the late 60s, Charles's philosophical musings and long sermons to his small group had hardened into concrete plans. His rhetoric, which once revolved around spiritual awakening and interpretations of music, slowly began to evolve into a vision of social upheaval. He claimed that a coming race war, helter-skelter, borrowing the phrase from the Beatles' White Album, was inevitable, and that only his group would emerge prepared to survive. In his eyes, the death that would follow this vision were not random but symbolic statements, designed to spark fear, create chaos, and mislead authorities about the perpetrator's true identities. The internal dynamics of the family were critical in turning theory into action. Charles rarely participated in the physical violence himself. Instead, he positioned himself as the orchestrator, the voice whose directions carried moral and emotional weight. Followers like Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian became executors. Some obeyed readily, trusting his interpretations and the authority he had cultivated over years of grooming. Others hesitated or questioned the morality of his commands. Yet few could resist the combined pressures of isolation, group cohesion, and dependency. The mechanisms that had bound the group psychologically now made resistance difficult, even when individuals recognized the extreme nature of the orders. Preparation was meticulous. The group engaged in surveillance of potential targets, noting household routines, security measures, and the number of occupants. Rehearsals were carried out in the form of discussions, mock attacks, and practice with improvised weapons. Charles oversaw the selection of venues for their attacks with careful reasoning. Some houses were chosen for symbolic value, others for accessibility. At every step, the methods were procedural. Weapons were gathered, plans rehearsed, and roles assigned. By distancing himself physically, Charles could maintain plausible deniability while maintaining absolute psychological control. He converted abstract concepts, impending chaos, racial war, and divine justice, into structured, tangible tasks for his followers. Importantly, there was nothing supernatural in his methods. Despite popular culture sometimes framing Charles's influence as occult or hypnotic, the mechanism was social, not mystical. He used rituals, repetitive sermons, symbolic language, and collective rehearsal to reshape perception, dehumanize victims, and normalize obedience. Substance use and communal rituals also amplified this effect by reducing individual critical judgment and reinforcing reliance on the group. Each act, each command, was carefully framed to make the impossible seem necessary, the immoral seem justified. In the end, this radicalization was not the product of magic, voodoo, or inherent evil. It was the result of decades of learned behavioral manipulation applied to a group of people whose vulnerabilities, emotional, social, and psychological, had been identified and methodically exploited. Charles's power lay in his ability to transform ideology into action, shaping ordinary young people into agents who could carry out crimes that fulfilled his vision while he remained the architect in the shadows. The night the headlines changed. In the early hours of August 9, 1969, several lives would change forever in the most horrific way. On this day, Charles's abstract plans became an undeniable reality. At 10050 Cielo Drive in Los Angeles, a house rented by director Roman Polanski and his wife Sharon Tate, tragedy struck most unexpectedly. Sharon was 8 months pregnant, a rising actress known for her warmth and charm. That night, several others were present. Jay Sebring, a well-known hairstylist, Abigail Folger, an heiress and social activist, and Wojciech Frykowski, a friend of the group. Also present was Stephen Parent, a young man who happened to be visiting the property and was unfamiliar with the household. Sadly, this would be their last gathering together, as each of them became part of a sequence of events planned and executed with cold precision by Manson's followers. Sharon, Roman, and even their guests had no reason to expect danger, so the front door was unlocked. It might seem crazy now, but back then, it was a common practice in Los Angeles homes. Unfortunately, it was a practice that would cost the group their lives. In the early hours, the Manson followers entered the home, a rental house where the occupants were either asleep or unaware of visitors. The group simply walked in, moving through the house largely unchallenged until the killings began. There were no alarms, no security guards, and no locked gates to slow them down. Their entry was silent and unremarkable, which made the sudden violence that followed all the more shocking. The crime scene was immediately shocking in its brutality. Victims were killed with knives and blunt instruments, and in some cases, firearms. Scrawled messages were left on the walls in blood. Messages intended to mislead authorities or symbolize a larger ideological statement. These markings, combined with the horror of the killings, contributed to a public perception that the crimes were part of some larger, cryptic plan. And this was exactly what Charles had envisioned. Yet behind the theatrics, each victim was a real person, with family, friends, and future plans abruptly erased in one night. Just one day later, the violence continued at the home of Lino and Rosemary LaBianca. The couple, chosen for reasons both practical and symbolic, was killed in their own home. Similar elements appeared: knives, staged arrangements, and writings in blood intended to provoke confusion and panic. Unlike the previous scene, the LaBianca killings reflected Charles's increasing reliance on procedural ritual to enforce the narrative of helter-skelter. For the perpetrators, the act was not only criminal but also an extension of the ideology that their leader had been cultivating for years. The human cost was heartfelt. Sharon's family lost a daughter, a wife, and an unborn child. Friends like Jay Sebring and Abigail Folger, whose lives had intersected briefly with the family, were gone. Wojciech Frykowski's family mourned the sudden, violent loss of a young man far from home. Communities across Los Angeles and the nation responded with horror, unable to comprehend how a small, wiry man could command such destruction without physically participating. Authorities initially struggled to make sense of the killings. The scrawled messages, the choice of victims, and the brutality of the attacks created a confusing array of potential motives. In fact, by the time the victims were discovered, it was immediately clear that something horrifying had happened. But the police had no idea who was responsible. There was no forced entry, no obvious motive, and the messages scrawled in blood were cryptic. Investigators were left puzzled over the scene, trying to determine whether the killings were the work of a random intruder, a robbery gone wrong, or something more calculated. The idea that a single man could manipulate a group of young followers to carry out these killings would only emerge weeks later, as investigators traced the evidence back to Charles and the family. Investigators would later note that the symbols were as much procedural as ideological. They were part of Charles's method of control, designed to distance himself from the killings while reinforcing the group's obedience. By the end of those nights, the headlines had changed. What had begun as a philosophical ideology, discussed in small groups and hidden among young followers, had erupted into public, unambiguous violence that shook the entire nation. The investigation and the trial. The killings of August 1969 were shocking and puzzling. How could someone enter a home, kill multiple people, and leave behind such cryptic messages without being caught? Who could have done this, and why? In the early days following the deaths at Sharon Tate's residence and the LaBianca house, the police were confronted with chaos, crime scenes that seemed theatrical, culprits with no apparent motive, and no obvious suspect. Investigators began by looking for connections between the two attacks. Both incidents involved knives, handwritten messages on the walls in blood, and similar patterns of intrusion. Though the style of violence suggested someone highly organized or symbolic in intent, the randomness of the victims, ranging from Hollywood friends to local residents, complicated the picture. Initial leads focused on ordinary robbery or revenge, but nothing fit the scale or the precision of the crimes. The breakthrough came gradually. The arrest of one of the family members for a separate auto theft led investigators to trace her connections. Phone logs, witness statements, and a growing trail of acquaintances began to reveal a network of young people moving around Southern California with similar itineraries. Names like Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten emerged as key figures. Authorities noticed patterns. These were young, transient people, often with histories of minor offenses, living in communes, and traveling with someone older. The same figure whose name began appearing in multiple accounts, Charles Manson. Physical evidence played a role, though the scenes had elements designed to confuse. At both the Tate and LaBianca residences, fingerprints, shoe prints, and other forensic traces offered tangible leads. Investigators collected blood samples, traced handwriting on the walls, and matched weapons found in the possession of suspects to the crime scenes. These objective facts gradually intertwined with witness statements and confessions, allowing police to construct a timeline of who had been where and under whose direction. Meanwhile, the media played its part in shaping public perception. Newspapers and television outlets simplified the story, emphasizing Charles as a single, malevolent mastermind who could bend dozens of followers to his will. Courtroom footage and press photographs amplified this narrative. Charles's own behavior in jail and during pre-trial hearings, odd, disruptive, and theatrical, reinforced the image of him as a near mythical figure of evil. While the headlines emphasized horror and spectacle, the forensic work and meticulous police work were less dramatic, but far more crucial to solving the case. Once authorities had gathered sufficient evidence, arrests began. Tex Watson, the most active participant in the killings, was apprehended first. Susan Atkins, who had openly discussed her involvement with friends, was next, followed by Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten. Each arrest revealed layers of Charles's influence, the extent to which his followers acted on direct orders, the loyalty he had cultivated, and the methods of control that had allowed a small, wiry man to orchestrate violence without lifting a weapon himself. Finally, Charles himself was arrested and charged, though his role had been peripheral in execution. His influence, however, was central. Trial and courtroom spectacle. The trial officially began in 1970, with Vincent Bugliosi as the lead prosecutor. Vincent's strategy was to demonstrate that Charles's influence over his followers was absolute, and that the killings were not spontaneous acts by misguided youths, but premeditated, orchestrated events. Using testimony from former family members, forensic evidence, and accounts of planning, he was able to portray a clear hierarchy. Charles was the architect, his followers the executors. Charles, in the courtroom, became part of the spectacle. He would sing, laugh, make cryptic statements, and sometimes disrupt proceedings. His behavior ensured constant media attention and reinforced the narrative of him as an extraordinary figure, a man whose influence could seemingly override morality and law. The defense argued that the followers acted independently, though the evidence showed patterns of instruction, rehearsal, and psychological conditioning. Ethical and legal questions began to arise. To what extent were the followers responsible? How much did suggestion and manipulation factor into their actions? Key testimonies from the trial were chilling in their clarity. Susan Atkins described the sequence of events with a matter-of-fact tone. Tex Watson recounted actions and instructions given by Charles, linking abstract ideology to concrete violence. Vincent's narrative wove these accounts together, often directly quoting them in court, and later in his book, shaping public understanding of the case. Critics later noted that somehow Vincent himself became part of the story, as he presented a definitive version of Charles as the face of evil, a characterization that would dominate popular culture for decades. Ultimately, the jury convicted Charles and his followers on multiple counts of killings and conspiracy. Originally sentenced to death, Charles's sentence, like those of the others, was commuted to life in prison following California's temporary abolition of capital punishment in 1972. Appeals followed, prolonging the legal process, but the outcome remained the same. Charles and his core followers would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. Through courtroom transcripts, press coverage, and video footage of the trial, the public narrative converged around Charles as a singular figure of malevolent charisma. In the end, many believed the trial exposed both the horror of the killings and the extraordinary lengths to which one individual could exploit trust, loyalty, and vulnerability. Aftermath and the mystery solved. When Charles and his followers were convicted, the public had one clear takeaway. A small, wiry man had orchestrated unimaginable violence through sheer force of personality. But there was an issue with the story. For years, it was told as if Charles possessed some almost supernatural ability to bend people to his will. However, decades of research, interviews, and analysis have clarified a very different truth. The mystery of how Charles controlled his followers and why ordinary young people committed these crimes is rooted not in magic or occult power, but in psychology, social influence, and careful manipulation. The first clue comes from looking at the followers themselves. Many were young, transient, and searching for meaning, belonging, and identity at a moment in American history defined by social upheaval. Charles offered precisely that, a sense of purpose, inclusion, and the promise of being part of a family. He exploited vulnerabilities, loneliness, family instability, and prior trauma, and turned them into dependence on him. The love bombing, communal living, substance use, and ritualized behavior were tools, not mere eccentricities. They were mechanisms designed to increase loyalty and reduce independent thought. Psychologists who later studied the case point to a series of well-understood social dynamics. Groupthink ensured that dissenting voices were marginalized, while identity fusion made members see themselves as inseparable from the group's goals. Cognitive dissonance encouraged followers to justify acts they might otherwise have rejected. Even the symbolic elements, scrawled messages, music interpretations, and ritualized behavior were ways of reframing reality so that obeying Charles felt necessary, inevitable, and morally justified in their own minds. Importantly, Charles's control was learned, not innate. Decades spent in foster homes, reform schools, and prisons had taught him to read people, anticipate reactions, and adapt his behavior to any situation. He had practiced survival through charm, deception, and persuasion. Charles spent the rest of his life in prison. He remained incarcerated for decades, repeatedly denied parole. Despite his age, public fascination with him never waned. Over the years, he became a symbol of evil in popular culture. Yet, he remained a man defined by his own manipulations rather than supernatural power. He passed away on November 19, 2017, at 83 from natural causes. By then, the public had long since shifted from fascination with the killings themselves to understanding the social and psychological techniques that allowed one small man to exert such influence over others. His death closed the final chapter of his direct life, but the effects of his actions will forever remain with those he victimized. What are your thoughts? Tell us in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Please leave a like and subscribe for more videos like this.